the man privileged to be the current president of the Silurians. Welcome. Thanks for coming out on this snowy day. But I'm not surprised because we all know Silurians are not wimps. Anyway, we have two new members. I think I mentioned at least one of them at the last meeting, Joe Connolly, who I thought was going to be here, who didn't manage to make it. He had some deadline thing. He is the voice of the Wall Street Journal on WCBS Radio. And Arthur Pincus, who is here. Please stand up. What should I say about you? You're with the City, you're with the New York Times, you're with all of the above, you're with anything you want. Just spell my name right. Okay. Anyway, please say hello to Arthur when you have a chance. I would like one moment of silence for a longtime member, John Anderson, who joined the Silurians when he was with Time Magazine, but then ended up as one of the outpost members of the Silurians in Chicago, where he was a long-time columnist writing the City Watch column at the Chicago Tribune. So let's just have one moment of silence for John. I think Mike Retko would think that's enough. I want to say that some of you may not know that the Silurians have several purposes, one of which is to help indigent members of our profession, trade, whatever you want to call it, indigent journalists or journalists in trouble. And we do it anonymously through our contingency fund, which is a separate corporate entity, and the help is anonymous. But I do want to report that the contingency fund, which acts periodically, has made a generous grant to one of our members in need. And so I would encourage you to think about contributing if you like. And if you know someone who is a Silurian or a journalist who's facing really tough times, let us know, and it will be, if we can help, we will anonymously. Mort Scheinman, where are you, Mort? Stand up. If you see this gentleman and you haven't paid your dues, you feel free to give him a check. We will have a lunch on March 18th. The speaker is a little in flux. We had somebody nailed down, and that was missed. She wanted to speak today instead of next month, as it turned out. So you pay attention to your emails, please, and we will let you know as soon as possible. I am sure by the end of the week, we will know who is coming up next month. There's plenty of time for that. Finally, it is my honor and privilege to introduce the guy I happen to think may be the best reporter extant. Now, I mean, Seymour Hersh, I think you can make a great case for. Bob Woodward, you can too, although I don't think he's as good as either Walt or Seymour. And there are millions of people we may not even know their bylines. Paul Steiger, if he hadn't gone into management, might have been a great reporter. Actually, he was a great reporter and a great editor. And he had the good fortune for us of hiring Walt Bogdanich from Cleveland. And as Walt was telling me at lunch, geez, I sent in a resume, and I got a call from this guy at the Wall Street Journal at 11 o'clock at night, questioning the exact timing of when I graduated from Wisconsin. He said, those guys are serious. I'm not sure. Maybe Paul would stand up and say this, but I suspect that in the long run he felt well reimbursed for that 11 o'clock call, since Walt won his first Pulitzer Prize for the Wall Street Journal. What do you think, Paul? Yes. There we go. Yeah, it was an easy answer. as I mentioned before, Walt has won 2 additional Pulitzer Prizes. I'm going to let him tell you about those stories and the ones that were better stories that didn't win. But I will leave it at this. When I was a new kid, right off the plane from the Anchorage Daily News at the Washington Star, I went in 1973, late 1973. I went to this party with my first girlfriend, who was from a kid at the Washington Post. And so there were Post and Star reporters there, and there was a great old science writer at the Washington Star named Judith Randall. And she lived with a guy, many of you in this room may have known, Bill Hines, who was another wonderful science writer. Anyway, so I'm at the party, and her brother was Jonathan Randall, a foreign correspondent for the Washington Post, so she knew everybody in the room. There was an old guy over in the corner. I said, "Who's that?" And she said, "That's Morton Mintz, who you may remember was a great investigative reporter for the Washington Post. Among his many stories was the Dalcon Shield." And I said, "Oh, I've got to meet him. I've read his stuff." And she said, "Mort has the highest sustained rate of indignation of anyone I know." Now, I don't really know Mort Mintz, so I would like to introduce you to the guy I know, or the guy I know with the highest sustained rate of indignation and the most careful, assiduous attention to fact, Walt Bogdanich.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you. Well, there's a saying among investigative reporters that, there is one trait that we all share, without which we wouldn't be investigative reporters, and that is a low threshold of indignation, which means that, in essence, that we get mad easily. Now, I've been doing investigative reporting for 35 years. Do you have any idea what it's like to stay mad for 35 years? It's one reason I like a good cold martini when I come home at night. It's unusual for anybody to do it that long for a number of reasons. Who wants to, all reporters experience episodes where everyone they're dealing with on a particular day, they don't like you, they get mad at you. Everybody has a natural inclination to want friends. I'm just saying that as an investigative reporter, that's a very rare thing when you're on the job and you're making friends. It sort of exists in the extreme. For 35 years, I've had people slamming doors in my face, telling me to get lost, complaining to my editors, and yes, threatening me. And I can assure you that I've been threatened with the best of them. There was the day, for instance, I came to work and discovered that I had become a named defendant in the biggest libel slander suit in media history. $10 billion. Now, I had an $11 billion trust fund, so I still had an extra billion to play around with, so it wasn't that big a deal. Obviously, the reason Philip Morris sued me for $10 billion was sort of the shock and awe of it. And to some degree, they succeeded. It certainly had an impact on how some journalists covered the subject, including 60 Minutes. And of course, they made a movie about that. I got the $10 billion lawsuit. Lowell Bergman got Al Pacino to play him in the movie. So sometimes things don't work out exactly as you like. Well, why were they so mad at me? Well, I was reporting really for the first time how cigarettes were made and how they were manipulating nicotine to addict smokers. My father died of smoking cigarettes, and he really didn't know how bad they were for him. But my story did set in motion a chain of events that ultimately led to the cigarette companies having to pay over $200 billion for stemming from all their lies that they told over decades. And in the end, I didn't end up paying them a penny. So there were some rough times, and you can imagine what it's like being sued for $10 billion, and you figure quickly who your friends are and your employer. Another reason I survived as an investigative reporter is that I don't dig dry holes. The quickest way to become an ex-investigative reporter is to spend your boss's money, for 3-6 months and then come back and say, I don't know. There's a lot of pressure on investigative reporters to produce because they've spent so much time. And what that leads to is sometimes when you dig a dry hole, telling your readers that you've struck a gusher, and that's where you get into trouble. And that pretty much thins the herd out there when wannabe reporters go out and hype the facts and are not straight with their readers and their bosses as to what they found. So the question is, how do I avoid digging dry holes? Well, I start out with a simple proposition. I look at something and I say, what is wrong with this picture? For years I was taking the Long Island Railroad, and I'm looking at all of these ridiculous expenditures and looking at and experiencing the shabby treatment that the riders received in terms of delays and everything. And I just had this memory of this experience of walking under these giant television sets hanging on the platform that never worked and no one ever looked at. And I'm thinking, why were they up there? And while we didn't, at the Times, really cover in any aggressive way the Long Island Railroad, or Long Island for that matter. And so I would go around and trying to convince people, you got to do the Long Island Railroad. I'm telling you, it's crap. You got to do the Long Island Railroad. No one was listening to me. I talked to people at Newsday. I talked to people at the Times. You got to do this railroad. I can't do it. They're expecting national stories from me. It's not for me. And finally, there was a big meeting of investigative reporters and editors, national conference, and the subject we were supposed to be discussing in this panel was, great stories that haven't been done. So in a room of investigative reporters, I was begging people to do the Long Island Railroad. No one did it, so I had my students at Columbia do it. And one thing led to another, and now there are a number of them it was a disability story. I mean, I knew when there's smoke, there's fire, and when you see all these bad things that are in front of you, I just knew we'd find something if we looked. And what we found was that like 97% of the workers were retiring with like full disability, extra disability in their early 50s. Basically, the day after they retire, they suddenly get, put on these disability payments, and they were playing golf for free at state golf courses, and it was pretty outrageous because I like to golf and they were taking up the good tee times. So that was an added incentive for me to go on. When I say what's wrong with this picture, I mean it could mean what's wrong with this document. When I was in Cleveland working on a story, there was an indictment of a businessman in connection with a trash hauling scandal, municipal trash hauling scandal. And everybody reported that, and okay, so what? No one's going to report it again. And I went to City Hall and I looked up, the bid. And I looked up the guy's resume, who was the head of the company, this trash hauling company. Not exactly, in Cleveland, I can say this with some degree of knowledge, you're in the trash hauling business in Cleveland, the odor goes beyond just what you're hauling, And so I looked at the guy's resume and I found that he was chairman of the board of a local hospital. Now, what's wrong with this picture, right? Trash hauler, mobbed up, chairman of a nonprofit hospital. So I decided to look at the hospital. And without going into all the details, I eventually found that the administrator of the hospital was a convicted felon who had never worked as an administrator before. The top doctor in the hospital, chief of the medical staff, was really dealing in prescription drugs. And there would be a line outside his country home. And it would stretch sometimes for a mile when people from all these different states getting in line to get by their drugs from him. The chief of surgery had been kicked out of another hospital for bad technique, and his response was undoctor-like in the sense that he paid a cab driver $500 to murder the guy who had fired him. At least that was the charge. There was a hung jury, and he never went to jail, but instead he went to operate on people. So now that's all good stuff, but what my editors loved was the fact that the chief of social services was a defrocked Catholic priest who married a divorced belly dancer on a Mississippi riverboat. That's the color that editors like. I don't care about this other stuff. You're operating on dead people. I don't care. Get this. I like that, Walt. So, I gave them what they wanted. My first Pulitzer was, under Paul Steiger. And, that came about simply because I got, again, what's wrong with this picture? I was getting cholesterol tests that were all across the board, none of them made any sense, and I were hearing stories about other people getting crazy tests and people telling you that their doctors eventually telling you that they were wrong. So I decided to look into medical labs because I thought measuring cholesterol would be sort of like, you're building a house. You measure, okay, it's going to be a foot, it's 12 inches, and it's either 12 or it's not. But apparently, it's more complicated than that, as I discovered. And that led me to do this series on faulty medical labs and faulty pap smears and all these, sort of pap smear factories that were paying people pennies to screen for cancer, and they were missing it. And it was a pretty powerful story, and it led to passage of the Clinical Laboratory Reform Act. So that's why I do what I do. I do it because, of course, it pays me money, and that's a nice thing. But I also do it because it makes me feel good at night, and I feel good about what I do. I'm proud of what I do, and it makes the world a better place sometimes. You've got to listen to these. You've got to be observant. There was a meeting for Bayer Corporation. They came over to the New York Times for a lunch, and I'm not sure why they asked me to sit in on it. And, I'm listening to it, and, okay, half an hour passes, people finish eating, they start to bail out of the place, and the business editor at the time, Glenn Cramon, said, "So, what's your #1 issue in Washington?" And as everybody's getting out of their chairs, the guy mumbles, "Railroads." And I thought, did I hear that right? Like, what's wrong with this picture? Teddy Roosevelt dealt with railroads. Who's talking about railroads now, And certainly not the New York Times. I mean, there were no railroad buffs over there in the New York Times. No little model trains or anything like that. And so, I'm thinking, well, this doesn't make any sense. They would be talking about the FDA, right? So I went around to people who were at the meeting. I said, did you hear him say railroads? And most of them said no. Finally, I found one that said yes. I go, I thought I heard it. So I called them up, and they told me this story about how the power of the railroad industry and how they were basically being held up because they were being charged whatever the railroads wanted to charge them. If you got to take something from point A to point B, oftentimes if you're moving large quantities of fertilizer, chemicals, all those things that Bayer was also into beyond Cialis and other stuff, although I'm sure they're selling boatloads of that. And I thought, well, that's a nice story, but it's kind of boring. I mean, look, it's a little bloodless. Who's really being harmed? Yeah, it's raising prices. A good story, but probably better for somebody else. But again, under the idea that, where there's smoke, there's fire, well, I'm going to look at railroads because if they're that powerful in Washington, they must be doing something else. And sure as heck, I found the way at them and their power through looking at how they had covered up their role in these fatal accidents. That was all started basically from a lunch where some guy mumbled railroads. There was another one. I mean, I've had reporters come up to me and they haven't had a good story in a while, and they're saying, God, I wish I had a source. I wish a source would call me. And I said, well, yeah, I wish a source would call me too, but you should, once you try reading the papers, there are a lot of clues in the paper, because reporters are on deadline, and they're going to throw in a few crumbs of things. I mean, hey, there's going to be very interesting items that they haven't had a chance on deadline to pursue, and if you read carefully, you can find them. And there was an AP story when I was at the Times, and it said something about all these people that were dying in Panama of poison medicine. And I'm looking at this thing, Panama, poison medicine, well, it's just a short story. And I read the explanation for why it happened, and that it was some kind of, accident, accidentally some poison got into the medicine. Now, I'm reading this thing thinking this makes no sense whatsoever. You don't run a pharmaceutical company with, a tub full of poison here, and a tub full of medicine, and then somebody, accidentally, jostles it over, and I knew that wasn't the case, and yet that's what they sort of wanted me to believe. So I knew what had happened before, that in Haiti, when I was in 60 Minutes, I did a story about how China was selling this counterfeit substance which was put into medicine because it was cheaper, and all these babies were dying in Haiti, and nothing was done about it. And I said, I bet that's what's going on here. Just, I bet. And 2 days later, I was on a plane to Panama, and one thing led to another, and we eventually did this series of stories about the global trafficking of substandard pharmaceutical ingredients, which played at least a small role in the decision by the Chinese government to execute the head of their Food and Drug Administration, which wasn't the goal that I set out for, Yeah, well, you got to break a few eggs, but no, I felt bad for the guy. But that's how they chose to deal with it. Another reason that I've been a successful investigative reporter, and Paul, cover your ears on this one, I try my best to ignore editors' suggestions for what to do. Editors have a million responsibilities, a million stories. And they may get up in the morning really excited about something that they dreamt about or something they heard about, and they're, Walt, I want you to dig into this. And I knew that if you dig into that, 4 months later, they're not going to remember ever having told you to dig into it, and there's going to be nothing really exciting there, and you're not going to stay an investigative reporter very long. Mike Wallace, when I left him after 4.5 years, he pulled me and said, Walt, you never did one of my stories. I said, you're right, Mike. There's a reason for that. They weren't any good, he would get excited about something, and then, a week later, his excitement would be somewhere else. And if I'm going to fail or succeed, I'm going to do it on my own ideas. At least I can control that. How am I doing on time here?
You're fine. Keep going.
Okay. One of the reasons I do fairly well in my business is I'm able to get people to talk to me, and I do that because I begin with the belief that everyone that I want to talk to has a reason to talk to me. I don't care what they tell me. I don't care how many times they push me away. If I believe that it just means that I haven't said the right thing. I haven't figured out which button to push. Everyone has a motive to speak to you. You have to figure out what that motive is. And I'm pretty good at that. And I'm also pretty good at not taking no for an answer. And when I went into Paul's office every day asking him to take me off money matters and put me on investigative stuff, he would say, no, I'm not going to, but I kept coming. So he knows how persistent I can be. The same thing really goes for public records. So much of what I do is public records and documenting, and that's how investigative reporting has changed over the years. It's become more scientific. You have a hypothesis and you prove it. You quantify the problem. You just don't have a bunch of anecdotes. And I love working with data. But there's a downside to that too. You have to understand that these databases exist as a tool where you should begin with the story and then figure out the database. You don't, begin with the database and then figure out that there's a story. And too often people become so enamored of these databases, figuring that there's going to be all these secret stories in there. And sometimes it ends up like this, and I'm going to read to you what a certain database reporter came up with and wrote in the New York Times. It was a Saturday in the heart of summer, the kind of day that averages more than 2 homicides. Yet the police reported no killings. One other thing happened that day. It rained. In fact, an analysis by the New York Times of rainfall and homicides for the last 6 years shows that when it rains substantially in the summertime, there are fewer homicides. When there was no precipitation, there was an average of 17 homicides every 10 days. When there was an inch or more of rain, the average dropped to 14. Okay, so we got the approval to hire several investigative reporters, and one of the editors asked me, who should I hire? And he was looking at a certain group of people, and he says, I want somebody who can do database stuff. And I said, well, that's nice if they can do that. But, you know, I don't think that's necessary. You have to know that there's data out there and figure out how you can use it and what it might do, but you don't have to be able to take apart an engine to drive a car. And it's great if you know that stuff, but but what I really would want is a good reporter, and who will dig up the facts, and when you see the need for a database, go to people who do that for a living. And that's what I do. Well, you know, what worries me about this new technology, what's great about it is it allows reporters to get all this information without leaving their desks. And what's bad about it is it allows reporters to get all this information without leaving their desks. Sitting at your desks and not getting out and doing interviews is not just bad for your health, but it's bad for reporting, because so much happens when you are in the company of somebody and you're interviewing them in person. That's the way magic happens in stories, because you never know what's going to happen. And I just worry that too much of technology is leading reporters to question people by email, and really not digging and not getting out in the field. There's also, I worry too much about this. Another downside to tech is just this whole emphasis on personal branding. And so many of my colleagues now are telling me how important it is to have, 10,000 people following your tweets. And I'm not against technology. I just don't understand. There's a value probably for a beat reporter, but for investigative reporters, anytime I would be spending tweeting, I could be reporting. And that's how I view it. And to me, it's a waste of time, largely. And I guess I just don't understand. If someone wants to make a case for it, fine, I haven't heard it. There is now a new emphasis on metrics and our ability to tell how long people stay with the story. Not just how often they click on a story, how deeply they get into the story, how much time they spend on the story. There's all these things now that we can learn about readers, and it's important to learn that. We do need to learn it. But I worry, because I saw what happened in television when they were the leaders in trying to monitor what viewers wanted. And I remember when I was at ABC, they swore that we didn't have minute-by-minute ratings. Of course, I knew they did because we'd see them lying around, And consultants and all this stuff, eventually what resulted is what you see. And a decline in serious journalism on television. And I worry that, any newspapers listen to that. I mean, you get, okay, well, stories are too long. I just think there's a real danger in becoming too much a slave to these metrics. In closing, I can say that the health of investigative reporting, I think, in many ways has never been stronger. No one expected that in this age of the internet. I mean, it's a way for serious reporting to stand out against the white noise of the internet. People will pay for that, as the Times and the Journal and other people are showing. They'll pay for quality reporting, and they'll pay for investigative reporting. And all these nonprofits are starting up, and they've given this sort of it's an era of rebirth of investigative reporting. We have more investigative reporters at the Times than we've ever had. People's attitudes are changing about the importance. Just to give you one example, and I'll close with this thing, to show you how the Times has changed, New York Times has changed with respect to investigative reporting. Here's a rejection letter that the Times sent to an applicant in 1984. Quote, "The Times doesn't have investigative reporters. Instead, our approach is to hire really good reporters with a flair for good writing who have well-rounded backgrounds and the potential to handle well anything from science to ballet. We look for intellectual depth. From such people, we get the kind of reporting and writing that wins Pulitzers." Interesting observation, and I'll leave you with this. The person who wrote that letter won 0. The person he addressed that letter to won 3. So, you know. Thank you very much. Oh, questions? Yes, questions.
3 so far. I want to volunteer to take this mic, Tony or somebody, but I'm going to exercise my privilege and ask the first question. Walt, first, thank you. That was, wait, that was sensational.
That was to wake everyone up.
What do you do with this massive document dump, as we used to call it in the old days, by Edward Snowden being dribbled out from Brazil and various other precincts and now being funded by an eBay billionaire? And the Times does a great story today about a law firm that's being spied on because it's representing Indonesia in a shrimp duty fight with the United States. As the real thing, as the last Hildy Johnson, how do you address this specter of millions of documents hanging over your head about to dump on whatever you've been working on for months?
Well, I haven't gotten involved in that coverage because, by and large, the people who have are locked in a room and don't leave and speak in code, and they move in the shadows, and too much of it is just sitting with documents and writing on what somebody leaked to you, which is important, and somebody should do it, and those are huge stories. It's not my kind of story. Because I want to get out there, and the degree of difficulty for someone, in a document dump going through there and writing what they see is not that high. It's an important story, but it, as we know, and the Polk Awards recognized today or yesterday, but it's not the kind of story that I think matches up well with my temperament and my wishes, for what I want in an investigative piece.
But what you read, does it make you worry that people can't just pick you up and call you? I mean, somebody on LinkedIn who was the head of the Turkish security service wanted me to friend him or some damn thing. I can't imagine the requests you must get and the assaults that must be being made on your persona, whether you say screw them all or not. What do you do about that?
Well, no one, anybody who wants to friend me is certainly welcome to do that. I don't see any, I'm not that active on social media. Let me be upfront about that.
No, but the question is, how much should people who want to talk to you and tell you a story worry about their security since everybody else in the country seems to be spying?
Well, that's always an issue. I think that, if someone really wants to talk to me privately, and they're certainly aware of the issues. If they work in the intelligence community, they're not going to pick up the phone and call me. There'll be other ways to contact me. People who want to reach me will know how to reach me in a way that will be private.
Walt, my question is, to you. You're with the New York Times, the greatest paper around. Your old editor, Paul Steiger, is with ProPublica. You guys can do investigative reporting. What about all the papers around the country that used to do investigative reporting and now don't have the staffs and the resources to do that? And what about all the scandals that they could have uncovered in local and state governments that are not being reported on now? Doesn't that bother you?
Of course it bothers me. But what gives me comfort is that there are an increasing number of nonprofit organizations out there doing local investigative reporting. They're spreading all over the country. And, I mean, so I really, I mean, the papers that aren't doing investigative reporting are going to die, and they probably deserve to, and they're well on their way. And I don't think presently constituted, like the Plain Dealer where I used to work, is now like 3 or 4 days a week, and there's like nothing. They fired half the reporters. That newspaper doesn't deserve to exist, except for one reason. It gives me Cleveland Indians news. And as long as they do that, God bless them. But no, I mean, I do worry about it, but I am comforted by the fact that there are these organizations organically, you know, rising up to fill that void because people want it. Maybe I'm, you know, naive, but I think we're moving in the right direction. Yes.
Bob McFadden, New York Times. I want to pick up on your theme of dry holes. This is an example. Most dry holes occur before you publish something. This is a dry hole, I think, that occurred after publication. Just a little background. I think it was 1987 that I and several New York Times reporters, some of the greatest investigative reporters who ever worked for the Times, Ralph Blumenthal, Myron Farber among them, did an investigation of the Tawana Brawley affair. By the reaction of the audience, I know everybody here understands what happened. It proved to be a hoax. There was a grand jury that said the same thing. We wrote a book about it after the series of articles, and now Al Sharpton, who was one of the great supporters of Tawana Brawley and never apologized for it, is ensconced on his throne, and every candidate for mayor and governor and the state legislature goes to him for his blessing. Is this a post-dry hole, or what?
Well, obviously, it's not a dry hole. Somebody ought to look at it and do it. I mean, everybody, those of us who remember that and followed it, have all wondered why this guy has continued to be in the spotlight and increasingly respected enough to have all these appearances and like you say, politicians courting his support. I mean, it would be a good story. What can I tell you? I mean, we've all wondered about it. There are some. It's a difficult story for obvious reasons. Paul.
Walt, I'd like to pursue the dry hole thing.
Okay.
Because clearly you don't do dry holes, but you must have either an instinct or a set of traps you go through to prevent you from going down the dry hole. In other words, it's not just noticing that there ought to be a story there. Sometimes there ought to be a story there, but there isn't.
Right. That's a good question. Early on, I received the most valuable lesson. Actually, I was in grad school, and we had a speaker I was a poli-sci major, undergrad, graduate school. I got it in journalism, and we had an outside speaker who came in and said, who was a noted investigative reporter, and he said, the way you pitch investigative stories, the way you pick them, is you find stories that have a minimum and maximum. And I have taken that to the bank. And what that means is, the maximum story might be, let's just say, for sake of discussion, the mayor's corrupt. Let's say, for sake of discussion, the governor of New Jersey is you know, has some issues, you know, and I'm going to prove it, you know. And you tell your editor, if everything goes well, I'm going to show that this you know, mythical guy that I'm referring to, you know, is corrupt, and I'm going to prove it. But you know what? If nothing works out, and I can't prove that in the people that I expect to talk to me don't talk to me, I'm at least going to bring you the following story. And that's a look at the Port Authority, where he exerts control. I mean, I'm going to look at all of aspects of this mythical governor of New Jersey, but I also know that he plays a major role in this other institution, you know, and I know I can deliver something on that. So I do tend to pick stories. That's probably a bad example, but I pick stories that look at the system and how the system isn't working. I'm not somebody who goes after scalps at all. I don't like that at all, because, you know, one crooked guy is going to be replaced by some other crooked gal, or vice versa, or whatever. And I prefer to look at, how is the system not functioning, and how is it allowing these bad things to happen over and over again. And those are the stories that I pick. And when I fully commit to a story, I know that the system is not working properly. And I don't know what I'm going to get at the end of the day, but I know I'm going to have a very important story to tell, and hopefully, you know, one that you know, leads to change.
Walt, I'm among many people who worry deeply with the coming of internet journalism that that was the end of long-form journalism and investigative reporting. Thanks to guys like you, Paul Steiger, the current editor of the New York Times, who once was an investigative reporter at the Wall Street Journal, David Remnick, I can name others. That's turned out not to be the case, and it's really cheering to see evidence of that in the paper every day, and also to hear you talk about it today. I wanted to ask you about the metrics. I also don't think they ought to be the be-all and end-all. I share your judgment about that. But I'm wondering, as I see the amount of space the New York Times is committing to investigative journalism and long-form journalism, does that mean the metrics are showing that the public really wants that?
The metrics are being refined hourly. And that's why suddenly the New York Times is filled with, like, hordes of people that are like 23 years old, running around in like sweatpants, and, you know, I mean, I mean, these these are the people that are, you know, doing these sorts of things, and getting the metrics and figuring out how to work it and how to make sure that people stay on with the paper long enough. I think the way it's reflected is less because of the metrics saying that people want it. I think it's reflected in the fact that when we started charging money, people paid. And they want this. In a democracy, people need this. And I mean, not everybody. People at Fox News don't need it, you know, but other people, pardon me if anybody's from Fox News, I don't know. You know. I'm just kind of angry because they've never asked me to be a panelist. But
We can make that happen.
No, please no. I mean, I think we're increasingly going to be looking at those metrics, and we've learned quite a few years ago that the most emailed list is ridiculous. That doesn't mean anything. Initially, it was something, and you could point to it. Now there are all sorts of other ways to measure it, and I don't know everything they're doing, but by the virtue of the fact they're encouraging us to do longer stories, and they're figuring out innovative ways to tell longer stories with the bells and whistles that are just wonderful. I mean, the written word is obviously the holy grail here, but when you can enhance the experience, why not? And we have the people now that know how to do that. And I'm confident that as these metrics start becoming more well-known in the newsroom, that I'm hopeful that it'll result in more good journalism instead of shorter stories, quicker stories, stories on the Kardashians or whatever. We don't do those, but other organizations do. Yeah.
Well, Tony's going with the mic. You miss Ben Smith, the editor of BuzzFeed. He said during his speech that they've discovered, reading all these metrics, that there's a drop-off, that 1,000-word stories are dead. Really long-form stories people really want. So you're on top of it, according to the leading BuzzFeed guy. Myra?
Well, I'm not used to these.
It's there. It's working.
All right. Now, I want to say that, apropos of a remark you made before about a maximum story, so to speak, and a minimum story, that in my time at the Times, one of the glories of it was that they would take a chance on there being no story. And I give you one example was I hadn't been at the Times long, but after Watergate, the Times received a tip that Gerald Ford had taken money from a union I won't mention, but had taken cash over a period of time from a union and not reported it, and what have you, while he was House Majority Leader. And I, wet behind the ears, was told to go out and find this story, and I spent maybe 5 months or so traveling the country trying to dig it up. And in the end, could not, there was some probability, but I could not nail it down. And the Times didn't
flinch.
Didn't flinch.
They wanted you to do it.
They didn't flinch.
Yeah.
They didn't say, well, Farber, you really blew it, or, go back to Harvard or wherever. I mean, and similarly, I recall very vividly a story that I was assigned for some months, looking into whether a young woman, a teacher in New Jersey, had abused literally hundreds of children out there. And we could have written a story about this whole scenario. It would have been a long story, and the decision of the editors was that we could not prove it one way or the other, and that if we wrote a long story, people would come away from it thinking there was something there. And I mention these two things because I think it serves the honor of the Times in that era to be willing to spend the money, to spend the energy, and to walk away when it was necessary.
Absolutely. As an investigative reporter, I know one thing, that there are no sure things when you start these projects, and no risk, no reward, obviously. What we try and do, and what I do a lot, is I bring my editors into the process, and we make a judgment based on the credibility of the sources that we have, the documents that I've found, and together, with how many wise heads I can find, we decide, is this worth going forward with? And when they disagree with me, I go forward anyhow. But no, but that's just sort of who I am. But no, but I do want to listen to them, and we do make a decision, and we go forward together, and I think that's the way it should be.
Hi, I run a small website. I'm a print journalist by background, but I run a small website, and I watch our metrics very carefully. But it has occurred to me when I look at the metrics of many large websites that metrics can be manipulated. Have you had much experience with this? Or, I mean, I think there's a really good story there that would blow the roof on the fact that the Huffington Post doesn't really have as many, et cetera, et cetera. Do you have any comments on this?
Well, of course, there's plenty to do there, just like there was plenty to do about the black art of, subscriptions in the news business. I mean, we see what happened with Newsday. I mean, there's a lot of funny business that goes on. But you know what? Since we're talking about metrics, I tend to subscribe to, in large part, to the Steve Jobs approach, philosophy, is, you just can't give people what they want. Maybe they don't know what they want. And maybe, no one got up in the morning and said, I want an iPhone. You give people something good and they're going to recognize it. And that's how I believe we should go forward and not necessarily become slaves to it. I'm worried about it. But we have some very good people. I mean, we're together discussing all this at the Times, and it's not by anyone's rule. It's just, hey, here's what we know, what do you think about it? And they're bringing us all into the process, so I'm hopeful that we in the end will do the right thing.
I have a question that comes out of a personal nightmare from my time as a consumer investigative reporter in television. But I'd like to know, have you ever been burned by a source?
I know this is going to sound unbelievable, but burned by a source, no. Because I just don't use sources alone. I want documentation somewhere. And I swore off anonymous sources ages ago. In politics, you have to use it, I mean, with certain judgment and evaluation. But as an investigative reporter, I want my stories to have believability, credibility, and you're not going to do that with anonymous sources. So I understand what you're saying in the daily journalism, you've got consumer. I mean, there's a lot of pressure to put these things out and to maybe trust someone more than you should or more than you would, if you had more time. Mistakes happen, it's part of our business, but you don't want a pattern of them.
You just mentioned mistakes happen. How bad a black eye has 60 Minutes suffered as a result of the Benghazi debacle? Used to be the creme de la creme.
You mean how many black eyes have they suffered? Because they have two eyes. I think it's going to be interesting to see what's going to happen there. I would like to have seen an independent, although these independent reports and investigations turn out to be not so independent when you look at them closely. But I would like to know more about how this came about, about the political beliefs of the correspondent. We'll see how big a black eye they have by how they respond. If they respond like the Times did, or other news organizations when there's a big issue that you screwed up on, and you do more than just, I apologize. You lay out how it happened and who's responsible. If they do that, they'll come out of it a lot better.
I don't think they've done as much yet, though.
No, they definitely not, I don't think.
It's almost time to wrap up. I do want to ask you two more things, Walt. When you're reporting at this high level without a net, and now you're doing multimedia, how do you train all the people who are adding all the bells and whistles on the Times? I mean, I know you often now travel with video and radio, and you have to do all sorts of different forms of the story. And the other part, which may be the same thing and maybe not, is what are you telling all these young would-be investigative reporters are the areas that might be most fruitful for them to examine?
Last question first. What I tell them all is follow whatever you're curious about. That's the best way to find stories. What are you curious about? If you're not curious about anything, well then, do something else, The first question was?
Dealing with it, with your new team that follows you around.
My team, and I say this not in a flint manner, they're a lot smarter than I am. I can tell you I did this 9,500 word piece, which is the longest piece I've done for the Times, with all the bells and whistles. We did it in conjunction with Frontline, and the bells and whistle people knew every fact that I knew after 8 months of working. I gave them everything. The guys were so sharp and so careful that I didn't worry about it. That there were, early in the days, there was something to be careful about because there wasn't quite that level of professionalism. But now, I'm just stunned by how good they are and how smart they are and how hard they work and how seriously they hold the same values that we, who write the stories and report them, share.
I think that's it. Oh, one more question, Grace. What? Stand up and shout it.
Okay, I had a lot of voice. I was bowled over by the Avalanche interactive story talking about traveling with the team. I know that wasn't good, but it paid off because it was even better interactive than it was in print. Is that the future of newspaper journalism?
Well, we have been trying that approach on, more, in some ways, more serious stories. There were 3 people that died in that. But we are now, yes, we are. We see that as a way to keep people reading and to give them the full experience that we're capable of giving them. Why not? If you know how to enhance that experience through this multimedia and all the bells and whistles and everything, why not do it? And yes, we see that as a way to, to sell ourselves.
Walt, thank you so much. I don't know what else I can say. The Muhammad Ali of investigative reporters.